Okay, to move on the concept of the divine decree. Now, what we're looking at is I've got a list here of about 15 different kinds of causation, because one thing that's important in our definition is the concepts of, well, is there anything going on that is an antecedent cause? And the problem is that most of the textbooks and the books on this, they just use the word cause without any definition for it. And this is why we want to be careful, because whether you're a libertarian or a compatibilist, the fact is there's lots of kinds of causation always that go on before an individual thought or choice. And to repeat myself, the issue though is efficient causation. Is it external or is it internal? So again, practical freedom is going to entail and necessitate that our thoughts and choices are internal and efficiently caused by us rather than efficiently caused by an external agent. So again, back to on or about page 7, where we're looking at now, I've got some key definitions that I'll use throughout discussions all throughout the rest of Essential Christian Doctrine. But what I want to talk about is a couple of things, like, for example, what is a contingency and what is necessity? Okay, contingency is pretty easy at the top of the page. It just means that an event is neither impossible nor necessary. Okay, that's it. That's a contingency. It's not impossible and it's not necessary. So now we move on to, all right, so what's possible? What possible could be based on, for example, what's logically possible? You can't make a square circle or a two-horned unicorn. Okay, so in that sense, whatever is not impossible, okay, is possible. Which, by the way, as you move forward, that actually moves to the very concept of divine omnipotence, which is that God can enact or do everything that is logically possible and doesn't violate his nature. Okay, so, but there's something God can't do. He can't make a square circle or a two-horned unicorn. Okay, that's not part of the definition of omnipotence. So that would be the concept of impossibility versus possibility. But then we get into necessity. There literally are about 3 or 4 ideas of necessity. I just want to cover a couple of them. Absolute necessity, by definition here, is this, because a thing is absolutely or simply necessary if its opposite or denial is self-contradictory. Thus, a thing is necessary if it is impossible to be otherwise. Like a triangle has 3 sides. Okay, that's true by definition, and again, it's contradictory to say otherwise. So that would be an example of absolute necessity. And then you move on to what's called the necessity of the consequent. Again, another type of absolute necessity, but this type arises out of a connection with necessary causes and effects that must follow. So when we take the necessity of the consequent, it means that because of X, Y necessarily follows. Okay, so that's the necessity of the consequent. And by the way, then there's the slight difference, the necessity of the consequences, okay, which is different from necessity of the consequent. This is a necessity brought about, conditioned by, very importantly here, a previous contingent act or event, so that the necessity arises out of contingent circumstances. Now, this is also called a conditional necessity or a hypothetical necessity. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this where you might say a consequent necessity would be something like, hard determinism, where, because of X, Y necessarily follows from it. So you might say there's something that's effectively or efficiently caused as an example of that. Whereas necessity of the consequences, a previous contingent act, something that didn't have to be, okay? Now, here's an example of that. It would be, for example, we think about the prophecy of the virgin birth of Christ. When we get to the analysis of the virgin birth of Christ, when we get to Christology in Essential Christian Doctrine 2, one of the questions we're going to ask is, what's the necessity of the virgin birth? And there's going to be a couple of ways and questions that people raise with respect to that. For example, well, was it necessary for Christ's sinlessness? Can we get a sinful human being in the race of human beings without virgin conception or virgin birth? That's an issue that's raised. I, for one, although people debate this, I don't think that virgin conception was necessary for sinlessness. But then the other comes down to, well, was virgin conception necessary to maintain Christ's unipersonality in the hypostatic union? So that's probably more likely, okay? But then we get into, why was the virgin birth of Christ necessary, even if God could have made a God-man some other way? Well, he prophesied it in the Old Testament, so necessarily now it's going to come to pass because God decreed it. See, that's the example of a hypothetical or conditional necessity, or necessity of the consequences based on something contingent. Even if God could have made a God-man without virgin conception, the fact that God elected to make a God-man through virgin conception and prophesied it in Isaiah, then necessarily it's going to be fulfilled because God keeps his promises, okay? So that's that kind of necessity. And then I already mentioned necessity of nature and liberty of nature, which is necessity of nature, the limit of thought and action grounded in a being itself. It means that no being can act against its own nature, okay? So, and then B, liberty of nature, the freedom that's proper to a being given its particular nature, okay? So those two go together. Now, a couple of kinds of causation, to really think about. And again, I listed about 10 or 15 different kinds here roughly on pages 8 and 9. I want to go through a couple of ideas we'll be using through the rest of Essential Christian Doctrine. The first is, what is a cause and how does that relate to power? I mentioned this a few minutes ago, where a cause is that which brings about an effect, okay? So when you think about it, okay, a cause brings about an effect. In fact, the very notion of efficient causation, which is in the definition here, is this is the cause that is productive, or the effective cause, which is the agent productive of the motion or mutation or effect in any sequences of the causes and effects. So now when you think about an effect, you can make a good case that all effects are reducible to two types: motion or movement, or mutation, change. See, when you talk about affecting something, you're either moving it or you're changing it. Something about its properties, characteristics, knowledge, something like that. So that's one. And then when we think about the concept of power, which I mentioned, power is the capacity or ability of a being or thing to do what? To affect motion or mutation. So that's why when we think about power, it's the capacity of a being to affect motion or mutation. So, for example, for me as a human being, I can produce effects. I can take this piece of paper and move it across the desk. Okay, that's motion. Okay, so, but I can't take the whole room and move it, 3 feet that way, because I don't have the capacity. I don't have the power to do it. See, so this is why the very notion of the kinds of effects a thing can produce, like a human being, is limited by its nature. And that's why we go back to God, and what true omnipotence means, even though there's a lot more to talk about here, is that omnipotence would mean that God has the capacity to effect everything that's logically possible and what doesn't violate his nature. So that's what would be true omnipotence. So now we move down to, I mentioned a couple of types of causes, like efficient cause. What's a material cause? This would be the substantial basis for the motion or mutation. It's the material or stuff on which the efficient cause operates, okay? So the stuff, all right? Now that's going to be important in talking about, for example, ex nihilo creation. The material cause is this: God doesn't use pre-existing material cause or divine stuff for the creation. God has to bring something into existence to act on it and give it its form, its essence, and so forth, because God can't bring something into existence that has always existed. Okay, so you need a new material cause. So we think about that in the concept of ex nihilo, or out of nothing creation. And then formal cause and Aristotelian causation. We've got the idea of, we've got a material cause, the stuff, And then the efficient cause can now infuse the stuff with its formal cause, which would be what? Its essence, okay, of the thing, determinative of what the thing cause is to be. So, and some would use this, for example, in the doctrine of creation for, all right, God made, and some would argue, first stage creation for the physical world. He made stuff, protons, neutrons, electrons, quarks, wavicles, you name it. And then God spent 6 periods, whether you're young Earth or old Earth, there's 6 periods where God directly and immediately infuses the material or stuff with its essence, making everything from water to dirt to, birds, rocks, and then finally human beings in the image of God. So again, so we think about it though, so formal cause, we think about what form does it take, what's its essence going to be, with final cause being, for example, the ultimate purpose for which a thing is made or an act is performed. So that's the goal or the purpose. What's the final state, or what is it finally intended to be? And so, all right, a couple other things here that are going to be important, and we'll end this segment. Is that, and again, I've got these listed on roughly on pages 8 and 9 of the handout. We'll use these also during our written discussions. But see, you can't say there are no causes that are antecedent or prior to us making a thought or choice. For example, and that's, by the way, it's even if you hold the libertarian choice, because, for example, I give the example here of what's an impelling or an impulsive cause. Okay? Even though it's not an efficient cause, think about this. It's the kind of cause that provides an opportunity for the efficient cause. It's a cause that precedes and prepares, but is not efficient. So, for example, very important here, human misery, okay, is an external impelling cause for divine mercy. See, the fact that we're fallen in a state of misery, that doesn't efficiently cause God to be merciful, but it impels God because of God's nature. So God cares. See, and the same thing with you. See, you see someone suffering, that suffering doesn't efficiently cause you to help someone in need, but it's an impelling cause, okay? And all of that is prior to the choice you made to help that particular person. So that's why you start thinking about these kinds of causation. Another idea is a proximate cause, okay? In other words, proximate means it's a closely related cause. In law, as well as in theology, proximate cause is used, for example, for foreseeability for something, okay? Is it foreseeable that if I do X, Y will result from it? Okay, and so that's the idea of proximate causation, particularly in a negligence case, as one of its elements. So a foreseeable cause. So all of these things, God is always the first cause, as we'll explore in divine providence. But what's a secondary cause? Well, God acts first as first cause, but one of the important things about free choice is there's always secondary free causation by the human being again, the free, efficient cause of our own thoughts and choices. We call that secondary free causation, okay? Which always is in agreement with the first cause, but we have secondary free causation. So instrumental cause, free cause, meritorious cause. All of this is going to be important that, no, you just are not in a vacuum making thoughts and choices. All sorts of stuff that's always influencing you, but what should always influence you is the truth of God, okay? And again, you have to have a love of the truth so as to be saved. More on that later, but if you don't love the truth, you will never become a Christian and you will never grow in the Christian life. So more on that later, but all right, let's take a break now. We'll come back and look more about the biblical understanding of the divine decree. Thanks.